Feeling so stuck in my head that I forget just about everything my therapist said. Maybe I'm self-helpless.
Hey everyone, welcome to Self-Helpless, where science, spirituality, and sustainability are brunch buddies. I'm Delanie Fischer, and details about today's topic can be found in the episode description. Returning listeners, if an episode of Self-Helpless has supported you in some way, a quick 5-star rating or review, if you haven't left one already, honestly keeps this indie podcast alive amidst the big old budget behemoths out there. So thank you for feeding the algorithm a little treat for me. Ad-free episodes are now on Patreon at patreon.com/selfhelpless, and info about some free goodies will be shared in the outro. Okay, it's podcast time. What is your definition of sustainable ambition in the context of your work and your book and, all that?
It really is about how do we pursue our goals and dreams in a way that's fulfilling, is focused, we're not scattered all over the place, and it's manageable, both in the short term and in the long term, rather than it being all consuming,
Right.
where we start to lose ourselves and lose our life in the process of pursuing what we want. And so that's one way that I define it. The other way that I share is I talk about sustainable ambition as also being a method. And to me, that means directing our ambitions more consciously, but also wisely. And I say the method is by aligning the right ambitions at the right time with the right effort. I just want to say, just because people might be like, ooh, right. Like people sometimes take that to be like, ooh, there's a right or wrong. What I mean
Mm.
by right is really that it's right for each and every one of us. This is really more a Goldilocks kind of right. Getting it right for you is really critical. Sustainable ambition really is rooted in the personal.
Oh gosh, I could have used all this over a decade ago, Kathy. Oh my gosh, you came into my life a little too late, but that's okay. I'll let it slide. That tool, it's super simple. And I love the visual that you have included in your book with that. Could you share just a little bit about how that works and how somebody could use that if they're trying to figure out if they're working on the thing that it makes sense for them at a given point in their life or their career?
So, right ambition really is about defining success on your own terms. It's about saying what is personally meaningful and motivating to me, and
Mhm.
rooting your goals there as opposed to rooting it in what the external world tells us we should be doing. And
Right.
so it's not to say that external achievement is all bad. There is a reality that we as humans, are drawn to that, and some of us are more achievement oriented than others. But where it becomes unsustainable is when we lose ourselves in that. And I say that, ambitions really won't be sustainable unless they're yours. So, unless you find some meaning and motivation in them for yourself, we can really lose ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's really research has shown where it's more likely that we are going to get to success if we root there first than the other way around. So
Mm.
that's right ambition. Right time is about being discerning about where we're focusing at this moment in time and thinking about what really matters for us at this time and thinking about it in the context of life and work together as opposed to seeing those as separate. And so it means making some courageous choices. And within this, it doesn't mean to me that you can't live big if you really want to live big. I just say, how can you make sure that you make it's sustainable and put structures in place to support you. So,
Right.
I don't think things will be sustainable likely if we don't make courageous choices, but I also don't want to dictate. Sustainable ambition for me is not as a no judgment zone. I don't want to dictate how somebody is going to live their life, right? Just I hope that you
Yeah.
can make it sustainable. So then the right effort is about, being discerning about how we're both applying that effort to our ambitions, not treating them as if all ambitions or goals or tasks are equal, and also being really discerning about how we're sustaining our effort and our energy over time. So, managing our energy so that we can be resilient and kind of pursue our goals over time and not burn out. And so you had asked, like, well, how can somebody use this? The method, it can be applied in a number of different levels. So, one way that I write in the book, I write about it in the context of kind of managing your entire life. So, kind of like rooting your goals and making sure that they are rooted in what I call your right foundation, your core motivators, and making sure that they are things you are motivated to pursue. And
Yeah.
then, and with right time, kind of looking at, well, are you focused on what matters now for you in your life? And then how are you aligning your effort and sustaining yourself over the course of time to support pursuing those goals that are a priority for you now? So that's one way that people can look at it. They can also apply it to one decision that they might be considering and might
Yeah.
actually say, like, okay, this opportunity came up. Is this actually an ambition that is something that I want, that I actually want to pursue? Does it align with my motivators? Is this the right time for this ambition for me to pursue it?
Right.
And then, do I actually have the effort and the energy to pursue this at this time? Am I being pulled toward this? So, it can also be a filter for evaluating an opportunity that might be coming up. And it also can potentially then help you determine, oh, could I up my motivation for this? Or, is this a priority now? Do I put it on the back burner? Or is it a way for me to kind of start to inch toward it and not completely ignore it right now and kind of keep it, on the back burner, but with the embers going,
Yeah.
or do I need to, how can I lower the effort but still keep it going? Or, maybe I don't have the energy for it now and that's just a reality. So there's different ways that one can use the method to kind of support them in making choices and decisions for themselves.
You have this tool that is very visual. I'm a very visual learner. Sometimes I get too in my head and it really overwhelms me, but actually being able to put, kind of rating each thing and seeing, I think what you call the wing, that can really make things clear for you. I remember over almost a decade ago, I had a lot of different ideas for a book. I always wanted to write a book one day, and I am so glad I did not pursue that 10 years ago because I was running a business. That felt like the exciting, more urgent thing that I wanted to work on at that time. But I still allowed myself to write down the ideas, keep them in my phone, all of that. Nearly a decade later, I'm actually working on those things. And I'm so glad that I didn't force through 10 years ago because I would like to think that, I have more experience now to pull from for a book. I kind of more effortlessly got a literary agent along the way. And it would have just been so much harder back then. And so I'm curious to know if you have any examples with either yourself or clients or, companies that you've worked with where they've used this process and realized they had to kind of put something on the shelf for now, and maybe how they circled back to that at a different point in their life or career.
For myself right now, in launching this book that I have just come out with in June of 2025, for the first half of this year, as I was launching this book, I have had a desire to pursue something else. There is some new ambition that is burning or is brewing, I should say,
Yeah,
and percolating. And yet I'm like, I can't focus on you right now. And I appreciate that I have this energy that kind of really is where my brain kind of wants to be. But I have this book to launch, and this is where I need to be focused right now. And now, post book launch, as I've been coming out, I've been talking about how I'm downshifting in terms of my focus. And part of that downshifting isn't just, okay, this intensity of book launch, but is also how am I redirecting my energy and redirecting my focus away from the intensity of what the book launch required and now toward starting to step into some new curiosities, well, without like fully letting go of this. It's still going to be
right.
related to sustainable ambition, but I did need to put certain things on the back burner and say, you know what, I need to hold on that until I actually have capacity and space for it now. Um, Another example that's in the book I'll just share is Christina Wallace, who, she's now a professor at Harvard Business School. And, in interviewing her on my podcast, one of the things that she shared was how when she was first stepping into that role, this is even something where, okay, she was moving to Boston, she was going to become a professor at Harvard Business School, and she was also starting her family. And she and her husband had really thoughtfully thought about, like, how do we want to create our family life? And
Mm.
the other thing that moving back to Boston afforded her, she thought, was, oh, I really want to bring choir singing back into my life. And so she started to explore that, and she started to put together what her life would look like if she added that, life goal, if you will, or life ambition back, into her mix. And she started to realize, like, oh my goodness, I'm going to both get to the 110% that I was trying to get away from in order to be able to focus more on raising my family. And I'm also not going to be able to actually create the family life that we really wanted. And so
Mm,
she purposely chose, like, I am going to put that on the back burner for now. And that's okay. And I'm accepting that that is okay. Or she's like, I'm convincing myself and telling myself that because that's what it requires of all of us, right? When we put things on the back burner. And she
right.
said, and I'm trusting that if, once I do have capacity or time for that, if it doesn't come back, then it wasn't meant to come back at that time. And
Yeah.
so, these aren't always easy choices, but we all are face trade-offs, right? In terms of needing to put something off. One person who I interviewed when I was doing research on career transitions and kind of thinking about how do we navigate our choices over time was a gentleman who talked about, at the time that I was interviewing him, he said, I'm finally exploring starting my own business. And so he was at a stage where his children were just coming out of college. And he said, I didn't want to take on the risk of starting my own business while they were in college. I wanted to be stable with my job. It was something that satisfied him and fulfilled him, enough. It just wasn't his ambition of launching a business. And he said, I just, again, put that on the back burner for, that time because I wanted to make sure they got launched and that I had that stability. And now I'm picking up this ambition of starting a business. And honestly, it kind of comes back to your example too of like sometimes we're rushing so fast to go
Yeah.
do these things when oftentimes, there's research that shows a lot of great entrepreneurs are actually in their 40s and 50s because they're bringing so much experience to that endeavor. And so oftentimes, sometimes waiting to take certain things on can be actually wise because you
Yeah.
have more experience, you have more capability, et cetera. So those are a few examples that I might share.
Oh, I love those. And I know that, the old version of me would probably try to make myself feel bad if I caught myself going a little bit slower with certain goals or projects. When I was in my 20s, I did everything at the speed of light and as much as humanly possible. And I'm 35 now, and now I view it as the fact that I'm going slower. I actually am really grateful for that because the way that I see it is my life feels a lot fuller now. When I was, single and I just had to worry about myself, I was, doing my thing. That's cool. But I have a husband now. I have dogs. I have a home. I see my friends and family a lot. I have better health, and all these things. And so I look at the upsides of going slower, because it's improved all these other areas of my life, and it's also really forced me to prioritize what I work on and when, which I think turns out to be better quality work, but also just more meaningful work. Can we talk a little bit more about maybe the upsides of kind of slowing down and being more intentional with your goals? I know we kind of touched on it a little bit, but maybe something that could help somebody who is maybe beating themselves up a little bit that they're not getting as much done as they think they should be getting done at this very moment.
Yes, I love this. One of the core principles I talk about in the book is pacing. And I do think embracing this idea of pacing can just be so helpful for us, both again in the day to day of managing ourselves, but also over time. And I think that, I'm going to contradict myself a little bit here, just in saying that one of the things you just brought up, Delaney, is this idea that, we do go through different stages of our life. And
Mm.
there are times and scopes of responsibility or what have you. And so, what I would encourage people to do is also to embrace the fact that it can change and that there might be times in your life where you're like, you do want to go, 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 or you're
Yeah.
really energized to go for it. And that's what the space is for. And it's also okay when that changes and you need to shift and allow yourself to step into a different pace or allowing multiple parts of your life to kind of fill up that space that might not have been filled before. I've learned in my research and talking to other academics that, we humans have certain tendencies that kind of work against us. And so it's also helpful to embrace our humanity and
Mhm.
be compassionate with ourselves and give ourselves grace. And what I mean by that is things like, we have a positivity bias, right? We also have a tendency to want to add as opposed to subtract. And we
Oh,
also tend to be overly optimistic about all we can do with our time. And part of the reason we do that is to motivate ourselves. And so when we don't get everything done, it can be helpful to kind of be like, oh, I was just trying to motivate myself. I was overly optimistic. It's okay. There will be time for that. And to give yourself some grace. And I think it's also helpful to kind of challenge yourself to actually say, because we have this, bias towards addition, to actually say, like, what can I subtract here? What can I actually take away that might actually make things just smoother, reduce friction, and makes things easier on ourselves. Also, all these ideal norms that get put out into the world in terms of who and what we should be. And I think it's helpful to challenge those and really to say, like, no, what's important to me around this, as opposed to just thinking you need to meet these external ideal norms as well. And that might help reshape some of the pressure we might feel.
Thank you for mentioning the ebbs and flows. That's so important. It's not linear. This ambition thing, not linear at all. And so, with the positivity bias, do you think we are maybe born ambitious, if you will? Are we conditioned to be?
My belief is, and based on what I've read about ambition, is that, I believe that we are naturally ambitious, that we
Mhm.
humans, and part of where I anchor that is also like humans are goal oriented. We have desires, we want things, therefore we are ambitious. So, ambition is really the definition that I embrace is really this idea of like, what is a goal for which, you have a lot of energy and motivation and you have determination and commitment around it and you're willing to put in the hard work to achieve it. There is a spectrum within that, but we all are goal oriented. So I do think we're born with that. And yet I do think that yes, society, we are also all impacted by social norms and by those around us and does lead to certain conditions, such as us striving for things that we may not even want, that might not make
Right.
us happy. And I think we don't often recognize that, this current narrative of how we define success, at least in Western culture, because it can be different in other cultures as well, that it is a construct and it is a
Right.
construct of our time. And, if you go back and read ancient philosophers and read about how they define success, it's not about, how much do you earn and, fame or things of that nature. It's much more oriented towards like building character or learning and growth, personal development, contributing to your community and being in harmony with your community. So we can redefine what success means. It's just a construct that, we start to get influenced by because of the narrative that is around us.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm sure having ambition was very vital in our survival. We
Yes.
we need to be ambitious about finding food, water, shelter. I can even look at my own definition of success and how it's changed so much over time. When I was younger, it was very much professionally oriented. I wanted to collect as many kind of professional accolades as possible. I wanted to earn as much money as possible. And now my definition of success feels very different. I like having spaciousness in my schedule. I like doing work that I find very meaningful, even if it doesn't make as much as X other thing.
I appreciate what you're sharing. And I think one thing that I'll bring into this conversation is this idea of adult stages of development. So, development
Mm.
is not just for kids, adults also go through
Yeah.
continued stages of development. And one model of that is by Robert Keegan. And, I simplify it down for these purposes. There's like four stages, I believe, in this model, and there's other adult stages of development. They're very similar. But, a common stage where over 50% of adults tend to be is what in he calls a socialized mind. And that's really where we are looking to the external world for clues about what is success and how should we be operating. So it's a very
Mm.
natural thing for us to be anchoring there. And so one of the things that I like to share that because I don't want to make people feel wrong for anchoring on the external or for using societal norms as our guide. That's a very normal
Right.
human thing to do. And yet, the next stage of development is really stepping into a self-authored mind, starting to really tap into, well, who am I? What is important for me and who do I want to be and who do I want to become? And so one way to start to step into that, I talk about four motivators in the book. One is, what is your vision? What is your vision for your life and for who you want to become? And not to make that overly weighty at all, because that's going to change over time too. But to hold a vision lightly, because that starts to pull us in a direction. And
Yeah.
without that, we can just, like, research has even shown, if you put people into the woods and they don't have like a horizon or a place to go, they just end up walking in circles. So you kind of have to have a sense of direction, but then it's also, how do you like to give and contribute? How do you want to make an impact in the world? That's another motivator. And then, what are your values? What do you really value in your life? And, both your work as well. And how, what does that mean for you personally? Because many of us can hold similar values. I value learning and growth, or I value family, or I value creativity, but how those manifest for each of us can be quite different. So being clear about that. And then the final motivator that I look at is, what do you love? What are those intrinsic things that you really love to do just because you enjoy the process of it? And how can you bring that into what you are pursuing? And so those are the motivators that, in order to start to step toward that I, guide people toward, to start to anchor some of their goals or their ambitions.
I would assume a majority of people tuning in right now hope and want and wish that everything lines up, right? The thing that they love doing is also really meaningful to them, also makes the most amount of money out of everything, right? But sometimes, especially in those transition periods, you do kind of have to pick what's more important to you, right? Sometimes they don't tick all the boxes, or at least not right away. And I found myself in that situation where during a transition had to choose between money and meaning, and I chose the meaning, hoping the money will catch up. Can we talk a little bit about how to help people with transitions and the identity shifts that happen with that? Because unfortunately, like you talked about, the social significance of maybe work or success or what we do, people can treat you differently if you go from having what is maybe seen as a cool job or a high status job to maybe something a little less shiny. So how do you prepare people for that part of career transitions or life transitions?
Mm. This is so important. And you're right that it really does anchor for a lot of people in identity. I think what is helpful is to invest in what I call life ambitions. And what I mean by that is just to acknowledge and embrace these other sides of yourself, and to start to plant seeds in other parts of your identity. Because by doing so, you really it can build resilience. Because oftentimes, especially in today's society, we anchor solely on work. And when that shifts,
Right.
we start to we do get wobbly, and we start to wonder who we are. And when we can embrace those multiple sides of ourselves, and really invest in those other sides of ourselves, it does, I think, build resilience for stepping into what might be next. And I think within that, even if you haven't done that before, the reality is we are multifaceted individuals. And I think if you can step back and pause and really say, what are the different sides of myself? Who am I? Who am I in the being, as opposed to just the doing? I think about Simon Sinek, who talks about himself as an optimist. That is how he anchors himself. It's not about what he's doing. And he
Right.
purposely chooses a word that is an adjective that is describing who he is. And so part of it is, I think, about shifting from the doing to the being as well, and also seeing those multiple sides of ourselves um, as we think about these transitions. And I think one of the things, as people go through transitions too, is to perhaps think about that definition of, like, think about who you want to become, or who you are becoming,
Yeah.
because that might be a way to also articulate and anchor as people ask you questions. Like, because you can also just simply talk about, perhaps, like, well, what are you curious about now? What are you exploring? And kind of bring your enthusiasm around what you might be starting to shape for yourself, to help anchor yourself as well as to anchor others. The final thing I just want to say is, when you're going through these transitions and going through these identity shifts, who you surround yourself with is really critical.
Yes.
Yeah. So to your point of, like, when people ask you, and somebody just said this to me recently, I was on a call, and we were sharing with across a different groups, and she acknowledged how people were kind of I've had, now I think about it, there are a couple people recently who've said this to me, where it's kind of like these judgmental voices of like, well, what are you up to now? What do you mean? You're trying to become a writer? It's like, what do you mean? Like, what's the air
Right.
quotes? Like, there's actually, yes, I am actually a writer. Those are the voices you do not want around you. Like, you really are those five people, like they talk about the five
Mm,
people who are close to you, and or putting yourself into the community around which you want to model, finding that, because they are the voices that are going to encourage you and support you. And that, that community, and some research has found, like, those certain voices can actually help you step into new ambitions. And
right.
so making sure you have the right voices around you is really important.
Well, let's say somebody's at a party and they used to be a rocket scientist, right? People are just very curious about that. And now maybe they work at their local grocery store and they can tell that somebody is kind of dismissive of them. Like, what are some tips for them to either respond or maybe make some transitions into new friend groups or, anything like that? Those kind of like hot tips.
I think that what can help is to recognize and remember that, like, we cannot control what people, make of what the effort we're putting into anything. We can only control what that effort means to us.
Yeah.
And so really anchoring back to, well, what's important about what you're doing for yourself now, and why is this role, if you're working at a grocery store, like, what's meaningful and motivating to you about that? It could be
Yeah.
that somebody is like, oh my gosh, I love this job because actually, like, all these older people in our community come in, and I'm able to actually have deep conversations with them. And it's really quite meaningful because I can connect with them and they find it meaningful. And that makes me a part of the community and supporting people in my community. So if you can anchor back to, why is this important for you now? And how is it supporting your life and what you want for your life? I think that can be really supportive. And it does need to be a narrative. The other thing going to
Yeah.
narrative is that, there is something around this idea of narrative storytelling for ourselves, which is, craft a narrative around, what does this mean for you? What is the good around what this experience is for you, so that you can go back to that and anchor in that when you might face some of these times of judgment.
When you do open up to somebody about, yeah, I used to be a rocket scientist, but you know what? I was really overwhelmed. It was very high stress. I stopped enjoying it. I didn't have enough time for my family. And now I'm doing this and it's, benefited me in this way. It does give the other person permission to say, you know what? To be honest, I'm actually really unhappy with my job right now. Or that's really courageous. You never know how that's going to impact somebody being willing to be vulnerable in that moment about why you made a certain decision. And I also love this shift that's happening away from asking people what they do. What do you do for work? That's such a default question. But I love the fact that people are starting to ask, what are you passionate about? What do you do for fun? What are your favorite hobbies? My husband and I were at a party recently, and somebody asked him, "Oh, what do you enjoy doing?" instead of "What do you do for work?" And he was talking to the other person. Both of them have pretty cool, impressive jobs if you hear about it. But I'm assuming if they asked what they did for work, they maybe ask a couple follow-up questions and that might be it. But they ended up connecting on the fact that they're both really enjoying gardening right now. And they were talking about basil and this and that. And they actually had a much deeper, more meaningful interaction than what do you do? And I thought that was really cool. And I noticed that this person asked my husband that very intentionally. So is there anything else like that out there that we can actually start to be more mindful of when we're interacting with people?
I just, created a question list for myself, as I was going to a family event, and I was like, you know what,
Oh,
I just,
smart.
and I used AI to help me, so I will just share that as well. And it's not like I
Yeah.
don't know these things, but I was kind of like, just I'm running a little late. Let me just like remind myself like some questions. Hey, what are you curious about these days? What are you interested in? And so that's like an invitation, to, just where are people spending their time right now? When I went to AI, to kind of reference this, I purposely was looking at three different books to kind of use as reference points. One is David Brooks' book that it's just one of his recent one that talks about communication and connecting with individuals. And he talks about things like, some of these questions can get a little too personal though, but so you kind of have to
Sure.
find the way. But like one that's coming to mind right now that he talks about is like if your life were it right now was a chapter in a book, how would you characterize this chapter? Then you have Charles Duhigg, who wrote the book Super Communicators, and he talks about the different types of conversations we can be having. And I think if I were to think about his book in broad terms, I'm not going to get every specific things right, but I think it's more about like, are you asking open-ended questions? Are you kind of clarifying and confirming? Somebody can say something, and then you kind of can probe and ask deeper questions and just get really curious about that individual.
Yeah.
Um, and then the final book that I'll mention is I was looking at The Power of Mattering by Zach Mercurio, who I just recently interviewed, and I just fell in love with his work. And I think that this is really about like, how can we help people feel like they are significant, and that
Yeah.
they matter in this world. And that's really important. And, even when he came on to interview, for me to interview him, I was going to say for him to interview me, but he asked a very thoughtful question as our first connection point. And here I was the host, he was the guest, and he asked a very specific question like, so what have you been doing this morning? What have you been up to? And I was like, oh wow, that's pretty personal. But yeah, but then I was like,
Yeah.
I said, "Oh, this is so lovely." Like sometimes people get on, it's so transactional. It's kind of like, let's get into things. And
Right.
he was like, "Well, if I want to model, and tell people that they matter and they're significant, I should probably get to know them, right?" Like, and so even asking
Yeah.
something like that, like, "Hey, what have you been up to this morning? What have you been doing? Or what were you up to this week?" And kind of like on your Monday, or whatever. Like you can make it more specific, because then it unlocks something to kind of bring more detail out, where then you can just get curious and just ask more questions. I think sometimes when people feel uncomfortable, oh, I'm an introvert, I don't know how to be with people. It's like the greatest advice I got was just ask a lot of questions, be curious about people.
I love that. Sometimes my default is, and of course it depends on my audience. I'll ask like, "What kind of weird stuff are you into these days?"
Oh, I
And
love that.
because then people start talking about like the alien podcast they're obsessed with, or the figurines they paint, or like you get to know people's kind of like the stuff that they maybe don't openly share. I'm curious to know what a turning point in your life was, Kathy, that made you reevaluate maybe the way that you were approaching your own personal and professional goals. What made you interested in this stuff?
I feel like I'm just a little nerdy around this topic, in the sense that I feel like I've been asking these questions all throughout my adult life. And I kind of go back to even when I was like looking at books, like trying to figure out my major for college, and was like, what do I want to major in? Like, even just thinking about it intentionally in terms of like what's drawing my curiosity, or when I was at school and even questioning, like, is this something I even want to pursue? Like, am I doing this just because I'm trying to get this external reward, or is this something like I actually want to pursue? And so I think and then honestly, like having an experience in college where like my undergraduate business program was really intense, and like I walked into a classroom my final week before finals, and it was like a Wednesday, and there was literally another assignment on the board, and there was still an assignment due in the class, and finals were the next week. And I'm like, what is that? And I just like in that moment I broke. I was just like, that was my first time
Mm,
of kind of like reaching a limit of like, I have no more capacity. Like
right,
this is a little craziness. And
right.
so, even from that moment, I started to make different choices around like, well, how am I going to, you know, integrate all these different sides of myself and make choices around how I'm using my time. And so some of these things started early, but then, it's not like I've always gotten it right. So I've experienced burnout, and I started to have a yearning for taking a sabbatical, and it took me 4 years. That's another example of putting something on the back
Oh,
burner
wow.
until it was the right time and I
Yeah,
could figure it out. And, taking a sabbatical, and kind of even in that moment, sensing a shift of like, how do I want to live and work differently here? And it's a question that I still kind of wrestle with, because again, something you long for and that you want to have a different experience, you get it and you start living it every day, and it's great. And then it can also change. We're always
yes,
making trade offs. So there are things that I revisit on a regular basis to kind of say, and is this still the way I want to be shaping my life and work, or does something have to shift or change?
definitely. I would love to know your thoughts on, a lot of people maybe who have reached some kind of excellence, let's say, or greatness in their professional life or personal life, whether it's a, professional athlete or, an entrepreneur. Sometimes they credit their success to obsession, being completely obsessed with whatever the thing is that they do. Do you think that obsession and sustainable ambition can work together? Do you think they're in opposition of each other? How do you feel about that, element of success?
So what I would say is, as long as it's really being choiceful. So I talk about with sustainable ambition, I talk about the U curve of ambition, that it operates kind of like the U curve of performance, where it's like of pressure and performance, rather. Like you can have too little pressure and you don't perform. You can have too much pressure and you also don't perform. You got to get the pressure just right. And
Mm,
what I would say is you got to get ambition just right as well. So it's kind of like, if you don't have enough ambition, you can be stagnant. If it's too much, I say you get into the severe zone. You can start to get into, an unhealthy state of ambition as well, hyper ambition. And so we need to dial it in. But what I would say is, I don't think obsession is completely bad, right? Like I
yeah,
said, like, do you have the commitment and the determination to go after certain ambitions? And sometimes that is what it takes to reach certain ambitions. And God bless people who do go after some of those things. Cause like you said, we wouldn't have certain amazing things in our world or
right,
experience the talent that some people bring into our world, right? If it wasn't for some of these things, or if people didn't even have the tenacity to, frankly, like become a parent or whatever it might be. There are so many things that this can manifest
right.
that really takes that level of intention. However, over a long period of time, it's often not sustainable. So, like there was a quote from the gentleman who created The Crown, the show The Crown. This
Mm,
was an interview he had done in the New York Times, and he talked about how, like, I love this. And he's like, but this is so intense, like it just isn't sustainable. Like he wouldn't be able to create that show, like do that show on and on and on. Like at some
right.
point he would need to take a break. So I think that those periods of obsession are fine as long as you're thinking about the long haul, as well as if you are aware of the trade-offs you're making in the moment. And so I think that that's what you need to be thinking about, is like, am I okay with the trade-offs I'm making in terms of having this obsession? And the real key place to pay attention to are the relationships in your life. And are you, through this obsession, putting some of the relationships in your life at risk? So if you look at the Harvard, the study that's been going on over time, over a length of time,
Mm,
and following adults and saying, like, well, what really leads to a happy, healthy life? And relationships is the number one thing that they have found. And so relationships are really important in our lives for our health and for our happiness. And so you just need to check in with yourself. Are you okay with the trade-offs you're making, and are
yeah.
you putting certain relationships that are really important to you at risk through this obsession? So those are a few thoughts.
You also mentioned, becoming a parent can be an ambition as well. I think it's funny that sometimes people don't recognize their own ambition because we put ambition in the category of maybe the professional life and not always the personal life. Where, I've been in conversation with somebody who's like, I don't, how are you this ambitious with, whether it's writing or podcasting or whatever it is? I say, I can ask you the same thing. What makes you want to cook dinner for people and have and throw parties and things that maybe doesn't sound super fun for me to do. So recognizing that ambition in ourselves, I think, is really important. I would love to know how you feel about this concept of there's all these ideas out there, and you have to really jump on the idea as soon as you have it and kind of race somebody, be the first person to that thing. For me, that's very counterproductive. And my perfectionism and overwhelm just goes through the roof. For some people, it might be helpful. What do you think about that concept that if you have an idea and it hasn't been done before, you better hurry up and do it ASAP because it's somebody's going to take it?
I think a couple of different things are coming into my head. So, because within that, like one thing is, like, I just reread Elizabeth Gilbert's big book, Big Magic, and I
Yeah.
really love her thinking on creativity and just this notion that, kind of, it comes back to the model too. Is this the right time? Do you have the energy to pick up? Like, and she talks about like how the muse might come around, right? And, or the genius, and like share this idea with you. And it's kind of like, do you want this idea? Are you able to pick it
Right.
up? Are you want to run with it or not? Because if not, I'm just going to take it to somebody else.
Yeah.
So I think there's that notion that like, look, these some might be okay if you don't have the energy, et cetera, to pick this idea up right now. But the other part of it that she talks about, and I think many other people in the creative field talk about, is like, look, you are unique. And what you like, every idea has been done, honestly,
Yeah.
like somebody else has written in some respects about sustainable ambition, but in a different way, and not with this method, and not with my lens, and not with my perspective. And so what you bring to it is what you know is going to be unique. Um and I don't know, I mean, there is a lot of research, and I do innovation work too, and so there's a lot of research and innovation on how it's just a reality that, like, because of these concepts of ideas coming up, because things precede them that start to cultivate this idea of the adjacent possible. I won't go into all of that, but it's like, it starts to feed into, oh, this is the playground now for these ideas to come about. And so it's kind of like, Thomas Edison wasn't the only one coming up with the light bulb when the time came, right?
Right.
And so,
Right.
yes, that might then make you think, oh, because so then I have to run and race. And I don't know. I think that's a fool's errand. I think you can just, on some level, it's kind of like, do if you really are passionate about it and you really, want to chase that idea. But also, like we talked earlier, sometimes taking your time, not like luxuriously, but like, like sometimes pacing yourself, or like giving yourself that space to, I mean, I will just admit, even with my book, like you said, you're taking some time, and I think that's really wise. In some respects, I think, oh, I might have done this too quickly. Like, I can see why giving yourself more space for certain ideas to develop and kind of come into the world can actually sometimes be the better answer.
And if you really are excited and hope the idea comes to fruition, for me, I don't care if it's me or somebody else that brings it to life. Other people are going to do similar things. I have just had to say, yeah, I thought of this idea. I'm not going to be the one to act on it. Cool. Somebody did it. Awesome. By the time that, I release my next book or something, if the title that I want is taken, I also trust myself to just think of a different title or put my own spin on it or tweak it a little bit to be different enough. My background is in stand up, and there's this unspoken rule. If somebody performs a joke on TV, anybody else who kind of has a similar joke or premise needs to either stop doing the joke or change it enough to be more unique so people don't think that you stole the joke, right? People are writing similar things all the time. And I know once I kind of understood that, it actually forced me to be a more original writer because I thought, okay, if I'm going to spend my time writing something, I really want it to be something that maybe hopefully nobody else is talking about, at least not through my lens. So I think there's also an upside that it actually forces you into a situation where you have to get maybe deeper in your work or be more original or authentic or vulnerable.
Absolutely. I think that's brilliant. I mean, I think that both thinking about, um, you know, each of us has a unique audience too. Like, there's
Yeah.
so many of us in the world, and then you are unique. Like, what is your brand? How do you want to, like, what is your lens through which you want to bring to a particular topic? And then I love what you're saying, which is almost like, well, there's a new constraint, right? So
Yeah.
usually constraints make us be more creative. And I think there's always an opening to kind of, like you were alluding to go deeper with something. And you just might, stretch yourself into something that actually is even better than what you were originally thinking.
Right, and it's kind of cool how different things can work for different people, right? The comedian who is on TV all the time or has a certain amount of exposure, they might really enjoy writing about topical, things or observational humor because they know that they're gonna be the first person to kind of get it out to the masses, where somebody else might think, "Ah, I'm not gonna, I'm on TV maybe once a year. I have to maybe, take a different direction." So it is cool how everybody can do the thing that they enjoy doing. I would love to hear your thoughts on the fact that, let's say somebody's in a conventional day job. Maybe they're not in, entrepreneurship where they're making their own schedule or deadlines or whatever it might be. I know that I realized that I was the one often making my day jobs more stressful, which with how I was approaching my work, I was doing a lot of things I didn't need to be doing. Can you speak to that person who maybe not doesn't realize that they're the ones making their job extra stressful day to day?
Mm. Like, one of the tips that I lean on, which is, I think one of the things that is the hardest for people is this concept of like, can we allow ourselves to dial things down a bit?
Right.
And it gets to what you're talking about, which is, and by the way, I am a hard worker. I'm a naturally hard worker. And so I will just admit that this is something that I need to practice with on a regular basis. And so I think one of the things around this, for example, is like, can we work on not feeling like we always have to do more, as an example? So it gets back to that example of like, is there what really is a priority here and what
Right.
needs to be done, and what can we subtract and get take off our list because it's really not going to add value? Or where can you challenge yourself to not put in as much work and say, this is just needs to be done good enough,
Yeah.
And I actually often challenge people to say, like, where can you allow yourself, maybe outside of work, because like being bad at something at work, but it's like, where can you allow yourself to just let yourself, not have to be perfect, right? Like just be
Mhm.
bad at something. Um, but then I think it can also be helpful to kind of challenge people from an effort perspective to kind of say, hey, where might I be able to do the 80-20 here? I mean, if you've ever really sometimes, the Pareto principle actually does work where you put in 20% of the time and you get 80% of what you need. And can
Mm.
you sometimes challenge yourself to do things on and either with that mindset or give yourself a sprint where you're like, I'm only going to give this 30 minutes and it's going to be good enough for now, right?
Yes.
So I do think
Yes.
challenging ourselves on that kind of like, how can we dial it down a little bit, so that we aren't making things as challenging for ourselves. And I think part of that too, from a work perspective, is getting really clear on what actually on your plate matters.
Mhm.
Both from a standpoint of like, okay, what's important for the business or for your team, and getting really clear if you have a boss, like getting really clear on like what is a priority truly, versus what are those things that really just have to be done sufficiently, right?
Yeah.
And you can kind of allow yourself to dial some of those things back.
Yes, those are such great tips, and I love, yeah, the 80-20. Like, 20% of the things are probably, yeah, they should be they should get done, and they have the best, outcome or the biggest outcome. I know that I wish I would have realized that earlier because I think when I was younger, I just kind of viewed like, gosh, every job is just feels so stressful, like, and not realizing that it was often my approach to maybe wanting to overperform, and I don't know, maybe that comes from the fact that in school there's such thing as extra credit and you're praised for extra credit. You can actually get more than 100% of something if you do extra credit. Or the fact that maybe in school we had timed tests, right, where you had 30 minutes to do something, and it created that urgency, and then I still maybe was creating that urgency as an adult or something, or I was still in extra credit mode as an adult. And so when I realized, wait a minute, I could just do my job, I could just do what is asked of me and maybe, give a little extra here and there when it makes sense. But I was over giving and overperforming to the point of exhaustion to where I was making my job not super sustainable. So it's something I wish I would have learned earlier.
This was something that Cal Newport actually wrote about, and he wrote about
Okay.
it during coming out of the pandemic, and some research that had found that like we naturally tend to work 20% too much. And
Mm,
so, what he was saying too was like that's why it can be really helpful to have like a manager or somebody outside yourself who can actually challenge like what's on your plate, or can challenge you to kind of be like, hey, dial it back a little bit because we
right.
don't always manage ourselves that way. And so one part of that is, yes, you might, one way to think about it is like, yeah, we tend to underestimate. There's also research that shows we tend to underestimate how long things take. And so
Yes.
you can think about like, okay, could I naturally give myself a buffer here, to just and or, let yourself off the hook again if you don't get something done within the time frame you kind of expected.
Right.
But I think that's why challenging ourselves sometimes on like, hey, is there a way I can actually do this? If you borrow from Greg McCowan's, kind of philosophy around effortless, like what's the an easier way to do this? He doesn't say it quite like that, but it's kind of like, what if this could be easy? Right? Or
Yeah.
easier, is there an easier way for me to kind of approach this or come at this or get this done? I think can be helpful to kind of challenge ourselves around that kind of tendency to overwork.
Yes, for the podcast. When I think of, oh, there's a certain type of person or, a certain expert I would love to show up in my inbox, I think, oh gosh, I'm going to have to reach out, send all these, emails and all this stuff. Or I can just go to one person who has access to a whole community of people and say, hey, I have an opportunity. Do you want to share it with your community instead of me, researching and sending a bunch of emails? Can you think of an easier way to do a task and get the same result or better even? What about for the person who is really trying, they're working towards their goals and they feel like they're spinning their wheels, they're not getting anywhere. What are some things that they can consider? Sometimes, we're in a situation, maybe it's a relationship or some other situation that is really sucking the life force. Do you address that at all with maybe personal situations people are going through before working on a certain goal of some kind?
How I might think about that is kind
Yeah.
of in this context of honoring like what matters right now in your life and or needs your attention right now. And that's part of I feel like what you're sharing, or I think about it also in this sense of pacing, because I think sometimes people we can forget that we want to do everything at once as opposed to
Yeah.
recognizing part of what I heard and what you were sharing was this idea that sometimes we need to cadence things, like the reality that some things need to come first before we can get to these other things that we might need to do or want to do. And so talking with friends about this, look, there's a situation in my family right now, I need this to get stable, that's what needs my attention right now,
Yeah.
and I'm putting off looking for my next job, until I can kind of get things in our life sorted. And then once that's in a better and healthier spot for, our family, then I'm going to take on, what I need to do around my professional next steps. So sometimes those are things that people do have to navigate. And, honestly, that's not always easy. Sometimes people being able to put certain things on pause, I get it. Not everyone is in the financial situation to kind of do that. But I still think, one of the things I talk about is like not being afraid to make our worlds really small at times, if that
Yeah.
is what is required in
That's
order
great.
to make things sustainable. And I think, I was just overhearing a conversation. It might have even been one of your podcasts. It might have been your conversation with Bonnie Wan where she was sharing,
Oh,
and I had interviewed
yeah.
Bonnie as well, and she was sharing how somebody had come back to her and sent an email like 6 months after the fact of when she had announced her book launch,
Yes.
and she said, "Oh, it both gave her permission to give herself grace in that, but also to acknowledge like." Life happens, and Bonnie wasn't judging her for sending her that email 6 months after, and here was this woman who graciously and kindly was like reaching out after that time period. But
Yes.
it's just to say, sometimes when we need that space too, those around us often give us grace.
I love that it's okay to make your life small or your world small when you need to. That is such a great way to put it, and I think it can really help us get out of that all or nothing mindset. I'm either doing everything or I'm doing nothing. Or you just focus on what really needs to be focused on, and it's okay to say this can wait. I will get to it when I'm able to. Do you have any thoughts about the way that ambition is perceived when it comes to gender? When women are often shamed for certain ambitions, and men are praised for it, or any thoughts around that and how people can maybe manage that in their own life?
It's unfortunate that that is like the perception, and honestly, like the general perception I think in society is actually that more often that ambition is bad rather than it being good. And so,
Mm,
part of, what I am trying to espouse around ambition is also just to reclaim it and to reclaim that term and what it stands for and how it manifests in our lives so that it is more empowering as opposed to feeling like it limits us, and which is so ironic, right? Like ambition is meant to be about like pursuing things, and yet it can really start to limit us. And what I mean by that is like, yes, so if women are judged for being ambitious, that can start to actually keep us back from pursuing what we want in our lives. Or if we attach our identity to ambition and then, we actually have a stage where it ebbs and it starts to wane. And then people are like, well, who am I if I'm not ambitious? And so I talk about ambition as being a state rather than a trait. And, what state of ambition am I
Ah,
in right now, as opposed to being this fixed thing that we are locked into, I think gives us more freedom. And so part of what I'm trying to do with this is like, how can we make ambition support us rather than constrain us? And I think that what you're saying about this gender view, yeah, I don't love it, right? And I don't
yeah.
know that I have the best answer to other than to kind of just to claim it and to not be
Right.
ashamed about our ambition, and also to embrace these other sides of it, to allow it to ebb and flow for you, and to recognize that it's not this fixed trait, such that when it shifts for you, that's okay. And oftentimes when people, this is my personal feeling, is like, often when people say like, oh, I lost my ambition, it's often maybe you did for
Mm,
the thing that you were pursuing at the time. And maybe you've reached the end of that growth cycle or that particular ambition, and you're going into a new dormant stage where you need to find what's next, and that's okay. And but we take it as either like this judgment of ambition or this like judgment of ourselves, and which I don't think is that supportive, as opposed to just being like, I'm in a new stage of ambition or a new state of ambition. And or it might have just shifted as well. Like sometimes people
yeah.
say, I do say ambitions aren't just for professional life or for work, it's for life too. And sometimes it's like, it's not that you lost it, it's just that it's shifted. You haven't lost your ambition for your work, perhaps. It's just that it's different, and you now have more ambition for your family and wanting to put time and attention and effort there. So those are a few
Exactly.
thoughts.
I love looking at ambition as this fluid thing that shifts and can go different places, and also something that needs rest periods to really thrive. So I know that you have said that work-life balance is a myth. I would love to for you to expand on that.
So let me just say, because of course I believe in sustainability, but I kind of like the term life work sustainability as opposed to work life balance. And the
Yeah,
reason being that, one, there's probably more than these reasons, but like one is that the term work life balance suggests that work and life are always going to be in equilibrium. And
yeah,
yet, things are constantly changing. You're constantly getting thrown off. And so when we don't have that expectation met, we get frustrated, right? We also start to think that like there's going to be equal parts, like work 50%, life 50%. And that
yeah.
also is not realistic. People also start to think that they can be hard boundaries between life and work. And I think that's also very challenging, and especially the way that most of us want to be living and working today with so much flexibility. And so it's not to say that we never need boundaries. But the
Yeah.
other thing I don't like is that it puts work first, honestly, just even in the term itself. And so it's
So
like,
good, so true.
right? I mean, it's just like it makes us think that
Yeah.
work is primary and like life has to come second. And so
Ooh,
I like to reverse those. And I think it's helpful to kind of for people to think about exploring, what comes to mind when you think balance, and what comes to mind when you think sustainability. And when you step into one versus the other, does one start to shift how you might approach how you're trying to navigate life and work? Because I also just think the term work life balance doesn't really actually give us, help us navigate what we're really trying to achieve, which is how do we make choices around the conflicts we feel around all we want to do across our life and our work. And so that's part of why I created the method, is like, well, how do we make some of these choices for ourselves? Or how do we, when we're typically challenging or asking these questions when we're going through changes, or we're needing to make choices across life and work, or we're running into capacity constraints. And so work life balance, I think, I won't argue with like each of us needs to find that for ourselves and what we're probably longing for when we use that term, but I just don't think the
yeah.
term itself serves us very well.
Amen. I could not agree more. It's so, so good. And I think it's like you get into this mode of trying to maybe achieve this perfection when it comes to work-life balance that just does not exist. And so you never feel like you've actually arrived. How can we start to actually reflect sustainable ambition and this concept into our calendars and our planners? What does that actually look like in day to day? I know you have quarterly check-ins and like the
Mhm.
annual horizon map and all these cool things, if you want to give us an overview on that.
Oh, yeah, that's great. Thank you. I think on the longer time horizon, yes, I do have the horizon map in the book, and kind of like how do we plan in arcs. Um, One of the things related to that that I also talk about in the book is that I believe that it's helpful for us in navigating sustainability to not just be thinking about our weeks or our days, but to really think about it on a longer horizon. So taking an 18-month view and kind of saying, like, what are the big things that I have that are coming up, even looking out onto the horizon, and then being thoughtful about where are those breaks, or being able to do that. You're able to start to see, like, oh, I have these intense time periods. How am I going to be pacing myself during this? Or, ooh, don't like put more on there. Like, I've done this before where I've even started, like, I've looked at the full map, but then I've started to zoom in even to a month, and I start to look at that month and I'm like, oh my gosh, I put way too many things here. And I either start moving things around,
Yeah.
or I start to block and be like, don't put anything more here. And so I think we do have to step back often and get to the balcony and kind of look broadly to kind of look at
Yes.
our calendars and our timelines. And then I think on a more close in basis, there's a couple of things that I might suggest. Like, one is, I advocate putting breaks on our calendars too. And so those are things like I just described on a broader timeline, but it's like looking at how am I taking breaks and pauses on a daily basis, a weekly basis, quarterly, monthly, put monthly before quarterly, and then obviously yearly. So
Yeah.
making sure that those things are on your calendar. And then the other thing, this is the last thing I'll share, is just, people often ask, like, well, how do I get those things that are really non negotiable into my life? And I say, put those on your calendar first. Are you actually prioritizing and calendaring those things? Because what we tend to put on our calendar tends to be what gets done. And so prioritize, get clear on what your true priorities are, be it your family, be it, exercise, what is it, whatever it might be, and get those things on your calendar, so that you do them.
Yeah, I have to constantly zoom out, and I need to do what you just said, is actually look at a bigger length of time and pencil things in that way, because I usually just tend to move things to the next week and then the next week, and then they just keep trickling along. But I have to tell myself I can be a writer and a podcaster and whatever, fill in the blank, for my whole life. I don't have to get everything done by Tuesday. In fact, it's actually better if I don't, for my health, for the work, all of that. So I love the zooming out approach. In the book, you have a really great example with the guy from West Wing. I'm blanking on his name. President Bartlett. Right?
Bartlett.
Okay.
Yes. Oh, I appreciate that you like this. Not
Yeah.
sometimes people are like, "Why did she bring the West Wing in here?" I mean, partly because like I just love the show, but also because I do think there's some lessons in the show in and around him. First off, even sometimes our ambitions, sometimes we need our community to even inspire our ambitions, or that it might take some time for us to get comfortable with or step into our ambitions. And you start to recognize that in his character, that he even hadn't thought about becoming president, but his friend plants that seed, Leo McGarry, and says, like, hey, I've been walking around with this idea like Bartlett for America. And it takes him some time to actually get comfortable with stepping into that and, embracing that. But then you start to realize, like, he really loves the job and
Mm,
he prioritizes that. And yet, and so he finds his motivation and meaning. That's the right ambition in the job. Um,
yeah.
the right time, for things, like he, has his focus, but then, he has multiple sclerosis. So when that starts to, it was in remission when he's not in remission, and it's towards the last season of the show, you know, he needs to be managing himself differently, and his team needs to manage him differently as well. And you start to realize, like, where these things start to overlap in terms of, right ambition, right time, right effort. He needs to manage his own right effort as well. But there's other examples in the book of the individuals, where CJ Craig, who's the press secretary, puts, her ambition for a relationship on hold until she's, going to come out of the White House. And, but you can also look at this story and also say, like, this is actually unsustainable ambition. Like, where do we like
Uh,
actually go off track? And like, it can be, a Leo McGarry is actually like a cautionary tale of being a little bit too focused on his work and letting his or his marriage suffering because of that. And so I just found it
yeah.
to be an interesting story, but also I talk about community as being something that's really important to our ambitions. And I think that's another element of the story that is present within that.
Yeah, I thought that was a great example. And there was something where there was a line in there about courage.
It comes out, it's in the second season of the show, and it comes out that he has multiple sclerosis, and his secretary had unexpectedly died in a car crash, and she miraculously on TV comes back to life and visits him as he's determining, like, should he run for president again or not. And she said, if you're worried, it's something to the effect of, like, if you're worried about what people are going to think about you, and you're not pursuing this to solve all these difficult problems, then, like, I don't even want to know you, Jed. Like, so it was, I don't know if that's what you were referring to.
Yeah,
It's
yes.
kind of like, don't let that stop you. Like, step into what you are ambitious about, or what you really care about. Like, you care about making an impact on the world, and making people's lives better, and that's what you should be focusing on, as opposed to the concern around whether or not people are going to like you, or whether or not people are going to support you. Hold true to what you really care about.
Yeah, it was something like, if you really are done and that's not where your heart is, totally cool. But if you're
Yeah.
scared, then,
Yes.
screw you, basically.
Right.
I think it just made me think of the friendships that I have in my life. And when in certain points they saw something in me that I couldn't see or I didn't see yet, and it really supported me on certain trajectories. And of course, you can't take everybody's opinion to heart, because you'd be flip flopping all over the place at all times. But the people in your life that you can trust and that have your best interest at heart and who support you. I think that was just a really good example of the importance of community, like you have mentioned. Is there something that we didn't cover today that you think is especially important for people to know or remember? And then where can people find you, your book, all that good stuff?
I think I just underscore, we talked about it earlier, but just to remember that you're human, and to give yourself grace. Be generous with yourself. Navigating this world as human beings is not easy. And so
Right.
just give yourself a little bit of grace as you do so. And to remember, this is a practice. And people can find me at sustainableambition.com. They can learn more about the book there, and can certainly listen to the podcast wherever they listen to their podcast, listen to your podcast, and can find me on LinkedIn as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This has been a pleasure.
Thanks for hanging out with Self-Helpless. Feel free to share this with someone who could use it, and you can binge related conversations linked in the show notes. Ad-free episodes are now available on Patreon, and because I'm practically allergic to social media, the best way to get notified about new episodes is to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, or join the email list at selfhelplesspodcast.com, where you will also find some free goodies like a watch and read list and the quote buffet. All right, love you big time, and thank you so much.